On April 26, 1942, the Benju Kalure in Liaoning Province, China, became the stage for the deadliest coal mining disaster in recorded history, and the tragedy was as grim as it was preventable, making it one of those moments where history feels less like a story and more like a warning carved in stone. The mine, controlled by Japanese forces during their occupation of Manchuria, was already notorious for its brutal working conditions, where Chinese laborers were forced into back-breaking shifts under the constant gaze of overseers who valued coal production more than human life. On that spring day, a lethal cocktail of gas and coal dust ignited deep underground, producing a devastating explosion that tore through the tunnels like a firestorm, collapsing supports, filling passageways with flames, and instantly cutting off escape routes. For the miners who survived the initial blast, the nightmare had only just begun, because the fire raged uncontrollably, consuming oxygen and spewing toxic carbon monoxide, turning every breath into a fight for survival. In a decision that still shocks historians, the Japanese authorities chose to seal the mine entrances in an effort to smother the blaze, a move that protected equipment and infrastructure, but effectively trapped more than 1,000 men underground with no chance of rescue. Survivors later recalled the horrific reality as some workers suffocated within minutes while others clung to life in pitch darkness as poison gas silently overtook them. When the mine was finally reopened, the true scale of the disaster emerged with 1,549 miners having lost their lives, a death toll so massive that it still stands as the worst coal mining disaster ever recorded. Yet, beyond the staggering numbers lies a story drenched in wartime cruelty, because many of the dead were not simply workers, but conscripted laborers with little choice in their fate, people whose lives were treated as expendable in the machinery of war and industry. Contemporary reports from Japanese officials at the time downplayed the tragedy, focusing on production losses rather than human suffering, while local families grieved in silence, their voices muted by the political realities of occupation. Over the years, the Benju disaster has come to symbolize not just the dangers of coal mining, but also the devastating consequences of prioritizing profit and control over safety and dignity. Mining, by its very nature, is dangerous work, but history has shown that disasters on this scale almost always come from negligence, lack of preparation, and callous disregard for human lives, and Benju is perhaps the clearest and most haunting example of all. Imagine for a moment how different the story could have been if the miners had been given even the most basic protections, proper ventilation, or the chance to escape rather than being sealed in like expendable parts of a machine. Instead, the disaster became both a human tragedy and a moral indictment, a reminder that the price of neglect is often measured in lives rather than dollars. Today, when historians or safety experts look back at Benju, it is not just the number 1,549 that shocks them, but the circumstances that allowed it to happen in the first place, such as forced labor, inadequate safety measures, and a mindset that valued coal over people. The miners who perished in Benju never got the recognition they deserved during their lifetimes, but their story has endured as a stark lesson, reminding the world that progress and power built on human suffering is a fragile foundation destined to collapse. Isadora Duncan wasn't just a dancer, she was a full-on revolution wrapped in silk scarves and dramatic flair. Known as the mother of modern dance, she tossed ballet slippers aside, twirled barefoot, and insisted on flowing tunics that made her look like she had stepped straight out of a Greek temple. But while her artistry was groundbreaking, her death in 1927 remains one of the most bizarre, tragic, and oddly theatrical exits of all time. Imagine this. You've lived a life full of passion, rebellion, and bold statements against convention, only to be taken out by your very own fashion statement. That's exactly what happened to Isadora on the streets of Nice, France. On the evening of September 14th, she hopped into a sleek little convertible sports car, all ready for a glamorous ride. She wore her signature accessory, a long flowing silk scarf. It wasn't just a scarf, it was practically her trademark, the perfect final touch to her free-spirited look. But what no one realized at that moment was that this very scarf was about to become the most infamous accessory in fashion history. As the car sped off, the scarf trailed behind her dramatically, fluttering in the wind like something out of a Hollywood film. But then tragedy struck. The scarf got caught in the open-spoked wheel of the car. In a blink, the elegant silk turned from harmless fabric to lethal weapon, yanking Duncan out of the car and snapping her neck. Death was instantaneous, and just like that, the legendary dancer was gone. The irony of it all was so striking that newspapers worldwide could hardly believe it. Here was Isadora Duncan, the woman who built her whole career around freedom of movement, around breaking out of stiff corsets and rigid traditions, suddenly cut down by the one piece of fabric she refused to live without. It was so shocking and strange that it quickly became legend. Some reports even claimed her last words were, "Je vais à la gloire," in French, meaning, "I am going to glory," before the car drove off, which only made the whole thing seem like a twisted bit of fate's dark humor. Others suggested she said, "I am off to love," which fits her romantic spirit but makes the ending no less tragic. Either way, the story spread like wildfire. Imagine being a journalist in 1927 and trying to write that headline with a straight face. Famed dancer killed by scarf in automobile mishap. You'd almost think it was satire if it weren't so heartbreakingly real. Even medical texts later coined terms like Isadora Duncan syndrome or long scarf syndrome to describe strangulation injuries caused by loose clothing getting caught in machinery. Only Isadora could turn a freak accident into an actual chapter in forensic medicine, but as strange as her death was, it somehow matched the spirit of her life. Duncan was never one for quiet exits or ordinary endings. She had lived boldly, scandalized high society with her lovers and her unconventional lifestyle, and had always demanded attention both on and off the stage. Her dances were wild, emotional, full of abandon, her personal life equally so. So in a way, her death was a final act in the same dramatic play she'd been living all along, a scene so unexpected and shocking that it guaranteed she would never be forgotten. Today, people may not know all the details of her performances, but they know the story of the scarf, the car, and the tragic twist of fate. And that's the strange thing about Isadora Duncan. Her death became just as legendary as her art. It's a cautionary tale about fashion and machinery, yes, but it's also a reminder of how life can turn surreal in an instant. The scarf was supposed to be a symbol of her freedom and beauty. Instead, it became the final curtain call. And somehow, you can't help but think that if anyone were destined to leave the world in such an unforgettable, dramatic fashion, it was Isadora Duncan. Just after 1 a.m. on June 7, 2014, along the New Jersey Turnpike, a group of friends, comedians, writers, performers, were heading home after a night of laughter at the Dover Downs Hotel and Casino in Delaware. In the van was Tracy Morgan, still riding the wave of his comedy career. Beside him was his longtime friend, 62-year-old James McNair, known to everyone as Jimmy Mack. He wasn't just a comedian. He was a mentor, a giver, a man who spent his life lifting others up. That night, he had joined the tour for support, for camaraderie, but none of them would reach home. A Walmart tractor trailer barreled toward them from behind. Its driver had been awake for more than 28 hours, nearly 2 days without rest. He never slowed down. At highway speed, he slammed into the back of their customized Mercedes-Benz Sprinter limo. The impact was devastating, igniting a 6-vehicle pileup and ripping the van apart. Inside, chaos unfolded. Most of the passengers weren't wearing seatbelts. Emergency exits had been blocked or jammed. A plywood partition separated the driver from the passengers, cutting off their chance to escape. In the very back, where the crash struck hardest, sat James McNair. He died instantly. For McNair, life had always been about more than the stage. Born in 1951 in Peekskill, New York, he wore many hats, working in a homeless shelter, cooking at the Salvation Army, volunteering at church, organizing community events. He built a platform for others, creating the original Uncle Jimmy Mack Amateur Hour to give unknown comics their first shot at a crowd. Comedy didn't make him rich, but it brought him into the orbit of Tracy Morgan. The two met in Harlem in the early 1990s and became inseparable. As Morgan's career soared, McNair stayed close, writing jokes, offering notes, even freelancing for Saturday Night Live. For Tracy, he was more than a friend. He was family. But on that night, McNair never stood a chance. He left behind 2 children who would never again hear his voice or see him perform. Tracy Morgan survived, but survival came at a brutal cost. His ribs, his leg, his face, broken in multiple places. His brain, injured so severely that doctors placed him in a medically induced coma. For 8 days, he lay unresponsive, balanced between life and death. When he finally woke, he couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't even see clearly. The man who made millions laugh now faced a new battle, remembering how to be himself. Rehab lasted 2 long months. Morgan relearned how to move, how to speak, but his spirit was fractured. He admitted later that depression consumed him, that mood swings left him lost. An upcoming show was canceled. For a time, it seemed comedy, the thing that defined him. might be gone forever. The lawsuit that followed was staggering. Walmart settled privately, with reports placing the payout around $90 million, one of the largest personal injury settlements in U.S. history. But even that couldn't close the wounds. Walmart's insurers fought the decision, questioning the settlement, dragging Morgan's name through legal battles, as though his pain could be measured in paperwork. The National Transportation Safety Board left no doubt. The crash was preventable. The driver had violated hours of service rules and sped recklessly into the limo. He took a plea deal, avoided prison, and walked away. But for James McNair, there was no walking away. His body was laid to rest in Cortlandt Manor, New York. His family received part of the settlement, but no amount of money could fill the absence of his laugh, his generosity, his presence. The Hawks Nest Tunnel disaster is one of those grim industrial stories that feels ripped from a dystopian novel, except it was horribly real and played out in the early 1930s in the small town of Gauley Bridge, West Virginia, when a project that was supposed to bring progress ended up writing one of the darkest chapters in American labor history. It all started with Union Carbide deciding to bore a tunnel through Gauley Mountain to divert the New River for hydroelectric power. A seemingly impressive feat of engineering that turned into a death trap for hundreds of workers. The job itself did not sound too insane at first, as the plan was to dig a 3-mile tunnel through solid rock. But the rock was practically pure silica. And when you drill through silica without water or ventilation, you are not just making a tunnel, you are basically creating giant invisible death clouds. Those clouds filled the lungs of the mostly poor men hired for the job, many of whom were African American migrants looking for work during the Great Depression. Instead of being given masks or any kind of protection, they were shoved into the dust storm with shovels, drills, and desperation, and within weeks people were coughing, wheezing, and suffocating from the inside as silicosis, an incurable lung disease, shredded their bodies. What makes this even worse is that the company knew silica dust was dangerous. The science was not some futuristic mystery, but keeping production fast and cheap mattered more than keeping workers alive. The deaths piled up quickly, yet officials tried to brush it under the rug. Some estimates say around 476 deaths were officially recorded. But survivors, families, and historians agree the real number was probably closer to 700, maybe even over 1,000, making it not just a workplace accident, but arguably the worst industrial disaster in United States history caused by occupational disease. The way it was handled only adds to the tragedy, because many of the dead black workers were buried in unmarked mass graves, their stories erased while Union Carbide cashed in on the project and the local community lived with the haunting legacy. The disaster sparked outrage among labor advocates and eventually forced the conversation about occupational safety into the public eye, leading to serious recognition of silicosis as an industrial disease. But at the time, the victims and their families were left with little more than grief, poverty, and scars of neglect. Even today, if you visit the area, the story is not front and center like you would expect for such a massive loss of life. It is remembered in patches, in poems like Muriel Rukeyser's Book of the Dead, in local whispers, in a scattering of memorials. But the echoes of those men gasping in dusty darkness still feel heavy because the disaster was not some freak accident of fate, it was preventable. It stands as a chilling reminder of what happens when human lives are treated as expendable in the name of progress. While the Hawks Nest Tunnel looks like just another piece of Appalachian engineering, its true legacy is a cautionary tale carved into the lungs of the men who built it and buried beneath the silence of unmarked graves. It is a story that deserves to be remembered not only for its tragedy, but also as a warning about the cost of greed and negligence when safety is ignored. Nick Adenhart's story is one of the most heartbreaking what-could-have-been tales in baseball history, and the tragedy that struck him in April 2009 still lingers in the memory of fans, teammates, and anyone who followed the sport. Just hours before his life was cut short, Adenhart, a 22-year-old pitcher for the Los Angeles Angels, had delivered the kind of performance that suggested his career was about to take off 6 scoreless innings against the Oakland Athletics, display of poise and talent that made people believe he might become a cornerstone of the Angels' rotation. But in the early hours of April 9, 2009, as he rode through Fullerton, California, in a Mitsubishi Eclipse with 3 friends, his life and the lives of others were stolen in an instant. A Toyota minivan minivan, driven by 22-year-old Andrew Thomas Gallo, blew through a red light at high speed and slammed into their car. The crash killed Adenheart, 20-year-old student and aspiring sports agent Courtney Stewart, and 25-year-old Henry Pearson. The fourth passenger, John Wilhite, miraculously survived despite an injury doctors call internal decapitation, something so severe that most never live to tell the tale. Investigators quickly revealed that Gallo was driving drunk, with a blood alcohol content more than twice the legal limit, and had a prior DUI conviction as well as a suspended license. To make matters worse, he fled the scene on foot, leaving behind the devastation he had caused. The details were shocking, but what stung most for fans was the cruel timing. Adenheart had finally overcome injuries, surgeries, and the grind of minor league baseball to earn his place in the majors, and within hours of proving he belonged, his life was gone. The baseball world responded in grief and disbelief. The Angels postponed their next game, and when they returned to the field, they played with heavy hearts, wearing black patches with Adenhart's number 34. At Angel Stadium, a spontaneous memorial grew as fans left flowers, jerseys, caps, and handwritten notes. Teammates, many choking back tears, spoke of his dedication, his quiet confidence, and how much he loved the game. Off the field, the legal process unfolded. In 2010, Andrew Gallo was convicted of 3 counts of second-degree murder, as well as DUI and hit-and-run charges, and sentenced to 51 years to life in prison, a verdict that brought a sense of justice, but no true comfort to the families who had lost so much. In the years since, Adenhart's memory has been kept alive through scholarships, dedications, and tributes. A Little League field in Maryland, where he grew up, was renamed in his honor, the Cedar Rapids. Colonels retired his jersey, and the Angels ensured his presence remained in their clubhouse. Survivor John Wilhite's recovery became a story of resilience as he defied grim odds, underwent groundbreaking spinal surgery, and later returned to the Angels' spring training as a symbol of hope in the midst of tragedy. Looking back more than a decade later, Adenhart's story is not just about a promising athlete lost too soon, but also about the senseless devastation that drunk driving can cause. His death serves as a sobering reminder of how fragile life is and how reckless decisions can ripple outward, destroying dreams, families, and futures. And yet, in the way his teammates, community, and even strangers rallied to honor his memory, Adenheart continues to make an impact far beyond the baseball diamond, a legacy not built on stats or victories, but on the inspiration and cautionary lessons his story leaves behind. It was April 10th, 2014. Just before 6 p.m., the sun hung low over a lonely stretch of Interstate 5 near Orland, California. On that road, a charter bus carrying 44 high school students rumbled north, its passengers buzzing with excitement. These were kids with dreams, kids from working-class families who had boarded that bus to take part in a 2-day college tour at Humboldt State University. For many, this trip was the first step toward a future their families had never known. Laughter, chatter, and the kind of nervous hope only teenagers can carry filled the air. But heading south, coming the opposite way, was something none of them could have imagined. A FedEx truck, massive and unstoppable, barreled down the same road. And then, in a split second that changed everything, it veered across a 60-foot grassy median. Witnesses said it was like watching a monster break free. The truck sideswiped a Nissan sedan and then slammed head-on into the charter bus with a force so violent it could be heard for miles. The sound wasn't just a crash, it was an explosion. Flames erupted instantly, swallowing steel and glass in a fireball that lit up the evening sky. Smoke rose thick and black, curling upward like a signal of disaster. Inside the bus, chaos broke out. Screams, heat, confusion. Teenagers who moments earlier had been dreaming of their future were now fighting for their lives. 17-year-old Jonathan Gutierrez had been asleep when the impact came. He woke to fire, panic, and desperation, leaping from the bus with nothing but the clothes on his back. He escaped with bruises and a split eyebrow, but his friends, his classmates, were still trapped inside. Some never made it out. 18-year-old Ismael Jimenez refused to save only himself. As the flames closed in, he smashed a window and began pulling students out, one by one, until he was overtaken by smoke and fire. He died a hero, his final act one of selflessness. Denise Gomez, also just 18, didn't survive either. She was a leader at her school, a soccer player, a yearbook editor, the kind of student who inspired others. Like Ismael, she carried dreams of being the first in her family to go to college. Adrienne Castro, 19, from El Monte. Marika Serrato, 17, from Riverside. Jennifer Bonilla, who had a twin sister on another bus that arrived safely at Humboldt. All gone in an instant. The fire moved so quickly, so violently, that even adults meant to protect the students stood no chance. Arthur Arzola, a 26-year-old admissions counselor who dedicated his life to guiding kids toward higher education, died later in the hospital. Michael Mivette, 29, and his fiancée Madison Haywood, both volunteering as chaperones, were lost together. This was supposed to be their second year helping kids reach their dreams. Instead, their names joined the list of the fallen. In total, 10 lives were lost that day. 5 students, 3 chaperones, and both drivers. Dozens more were badly injured, some dragged out of the flames with their bodies burning. Survivors later recalled moments that sounded like a nightmare. Friends engulfed by fire, smoke so thick they could hardly breathe, windows cracking under the heat. Some victims were burned so badly they could only be identified by dental records or DNA. On the morning of April 16, 1947, the people of Texas City, Texas, woke up to what seemed like an ordinary day. At the busy port, a French cargo ship called the SS Grand Camp was docked with a load that didn't sound particularly threatening. About 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. Fertilizer is usually associated with farming and growth, but in certain conditions, it can become highly unstable and explosive. That morning, a fire broke out in the ship's hold, and smoke started curling into the sky. Workers tried to fight the blaze, even sealing the hatches and pumping in steam in hopes of smothering it, but the attempt only made things worse. The fire heated the chemicals inside, and just before 9 a.m., the ship erupted in a massive explosion that instantly turned the harbor into a scene of destruction. The force of the blast was staggering. It tore through the port, shattering buildings, igniting refineries, and sending shockwaves for miles. People in Houston, nearly 40 miles away, reported windows rattling from the impact. A column of fire and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air, and fragments of the ship were hurled across the city. One piece of the anchor landed more than a mile inland. The explosion was so powerful that it generated a tidal wave, tossing ships onto the shore and creating chaos both on land and water. Fires spread rapidly, and secondary explosions from nearby oil storage tanks only deepened the catastrophe. Within moments, Texas City went from a thriving port community to a disaster zone. The human cost was devastating. At least 581 people were officially killed, though the real toll was likely higher, as some victims were never identified. Over 5,000 people were injured, hospitals were overwhelmed, and more than 500 homes were destroyed, leaving thousands homeless. Rescue workers and volunteers poured in from surrounding areas, but the scale of the destruction was overwhelming, and grim scenes of search and recovery unfolded in the days that followed. Beyond the physical damage, the disaster left scars on the community that took years to heal. The Texas City disaster became a turning point in how the United States handled hazardous materials. It exposed the dangers of storing and transporting volatile chemicals without proper safeguards, and it led to significant changes in safety regulations. It also sparked one of the first major class action lawsuits against the federal government, as survivors and families of victims sought accountability under the newly passed Federal Tort Claims Act. The tragedy served as a painful reminder of how quickly ordinary materials could become deadly under the wrong circumstances. Today, the Texas City disaster of 1947 is remembered not only as the deadliest industrial accident in U.S. history, but also as a lesson in vigilance, safety, and the need to respect the sheer power of the chemicals that fuel modern industry. Steve Prefontaine was not just another talented runner. He was the embodiment of grit, rebellion, and ambition in American athletics during the early 1970s. Born in Coos Bay, Oregon, he grew up in a working-class family and quickly discovered that his legs could carry him further and faster than most. At the University of Oregon, under the guidance of coach Bill Bowerman, Prefontaine transformed into one of the most electrifying distance runners in the world. He wasn't simply winning races, he was attacking them with an intensity that made track and field exciting to watch. He never sat back and waited for the last lap. He charged from the front, forcing others to keep up with his blistering pace. His charisma, rebellious streak, and unapologetic confidence earned him fans far beyond the track, and by the early 70s, he was a household name among sports enthusiasts. Many believed that the 1976 Montreal Olympics would be the stage where he finally claimed a gold medal, cementing his place as one of the greatest runners in history. But fate cruel and unforgiving, had other plans. On the night of May 29, 1975, after a small gathering following a meet in Eugene, Prefontaine was driving his bright red 1973 MGB convertible through the winding roads of his hometown. He had dropped off his friend and fellow runner Frank Shorter and was making his way back when tragedy struck. Around 12:30 a.m., his car veered left, struck a curb, and slammed into a rock wall. The vehicle flipped onto its side, and Prefontaine was pinned beneath it, unable to escape. By the time paramedics arrived, he had suffocated from the weight of the overturned car. He was only 24 years old. In a single, devastating moment, the world lost a rising star whose career and life had seemed destined for greatness. The aftermath of his death was marked by both shock and mourning. Reports indicated that Prefontaine's blood alcohol content was above the legal limit, sparking debates about the circumstances of the crash. Some witnesses claimed there may have been another vehicle involved, while others insisted it was a tragic accident brought on by late-night driving on a narrow road. Regardless of the details, the fact remained: one of America's most promising athletes had been taken far too soon. His funeral drew thousands of mourners, a testament to the impact he had made in such a short span of time. For the running community, his loss was more than personal. It felt like the air had been taken out of the sport itself. People didn't just admire his talent, they believed in the fire he carried, the belief that running was not just about medals but about courage, spirit, and leaving nothing behind on the track. Today, his legacy lives on in countless ways. The site of his crash in Eugene, now known as Pre's Rock, has become a pilgrimage point for runners from around the globe. Visitors leave medals, race bibs, shoes, and handwritten notes, paying tribute to the man who inspired generations to lace up their shoes and chase greatness. His story has been told through documentaries, films like Without Limits and Prefontaine, and books that dive into his complex personality, a man both celebrated for his fearless competitiveness and remembered for the tragic brevity of his life. While he never got the chance to compete in Montreal, Prefontaine's influence helped fuel the American running boom and solidified his reputation as a symbol of determination and defiance. Even in death, his legend continues to run far ahead of the rest. It was April 25, 2019, in Lakewood, Colorado. Traffic on Interstate 70 had already slowed to a crawl after a school bus crash near the Ward Road exit. Cars lined up for miles, engines idling, drivers impatient but unaware that something far worse was barreling toward them. Around 4:30 p.m., 23-year-old Rogel Lazaro Aguilera Medeiros was coming down the steep mountain stretch near Genesee in an 18-wheeler stacked high with lumber. He was young, originally from Cuba, living in Texas and working for a small Houston trucking company. But that afternoon, something was terribly wrong. His truck wasn't slowing. It was speeding up. Witnesses saw it flying downhill at over 85 miles per hour, smoke pouring from the wheels. He blew past a runaway truck ramp, then another. Exit after exit flashed by, each a chance to stop the disaster. He never took them. Ahead, traffic had nearly stopped, backed up from the earlier crash. Dozens of people sat trapped in their cars, unaware that death was racing straight toward them. Aguilera Medeiros swerved desperately, weaving between vehicles, nearly forcing some off the road. One driver even went live on social media, capturing the semi thundering past at impossible speed. Seconds later, the inevitable happened. The truck slammed into the line of traffic, minus 28 vehicles crushed in an instant, including 3 other semis. The force unleashed chaos. One truck carried gasoline, another mattresses, combined with Aguilera Medeiros' load of lumber. The collision turned the highway into an inferno. Flames erupted. Black smoke rose into the sky. Explosions echoed across Lakewood. People miles away could see the fire and hear the blasts. By the time emergency crews arrived, the scene was apocalyptic. 4 men were gone. 61-year-old Doyle Harrison, 67-year-old William Bailey, 69-year-old Stanley Politano, and 24-year-old Miguel Angel Lamas Arellano. 6 more were badly injured, among them an EMT named Malaya Harsh, who was pregnant at the time. She later admitted she thought she and her baby were going to die. Somehow both survived. Firefighters battled the blaze for hours. The wreckage smoldered until nearly 10 p.m. The interstate didn't reopen until the next evening. Aguilera Medeiros himself walked away without a scratch. He didn't run, didn't resist. Police arrested him the next morning. At first, he faced vehicular manslaughter charges, but investigators pushed further. 40 charges were eventually filed: vehicular assault, reckless driving, and multiple counts of first-degree assault with extreme indifference. In court, Aguilera Medeiros wept, insisting he never wanted to hurt anyone, that his brakes had failed. He had no record, no history of violence, just a wife and a young son waiting at home. But prosecutors saw it differently. They argued he had blown past every warning sign, ignored every escape ramp, and drove recklessly into disaster. They pointed to his employer, Castellano 03 Trucking, a company riddled with safety violations, even hiring drivers who couldn't read English on roads where every critical warning sign was written in it. The trial came in September 2021. A jury convicted him on 27 charges. That December, Judge Bruce Jones handed down a sentence so staggering it shocked the nation, minus 110 years in prison. The judge admitted his hands were tied by Colorado law, but said plainly the punishment was more than he believed was fair. Millions signed a petition demanding justice. On December 30th, 2021, Colorado's governor stepped in. The sentence was reduced to 10 years. Aguilera Medeiros would still serve time, but not die in prison. On the morning of March 20th, 1905, the city of Brockton, Massachusetts, was alive with the steady rhythm of industry. At the Grover Shoe Factory, one of the area's most important employers, workers filed in as usual, expecting another long day of stitching leather, gluing soles, and keeping production lines moving. The 5-story brick building stood proudly as a symbol of progress and opportunity, housing nearly 400 men and women who relied on it to provide for their families. But in the basement, hidden from sight, a much older and more dangerous presence lurked. The factory's steam boiler, a piece of equipment that powered much of the operation, had been running past its prime, and while it had been patched and checked, it was ultimately a ticking time bomb waiting to ignite disaster. Just before 8 a.m., the unimaginable happened. With a deafening roar, the boiler exploded with such force that it tore through the basement and shot upward, ripping apart the floors above it like paper. The initial blast was so violent that it destroyed the main support columns, causing massive sections of the building to collapse instantly. Those on the lower floors were caught completely off guard, buried beneath falling beams and heavy machinery. The explosion also ignited fires that quickly spread, fueled by shoe materials like leather, fabric, and adhesives, all highly flammable. In moments, what had been a bustling factory was transformed into a nightmare of smoke, flames, and twisted wreckage. Workers screamed for help as the fire consumed the building, and those who managed to survive the initial collapse scrambled desperately for exits that were either blocked or already engulfed in flames. Rescue efforts began immediately, but they were harrowing and dangerous. Firefighters, police, and townspeople rushed to the scene, pulling survivors from the wreckage and braving the inferno to save those still trapped inside. Yet for many, it was too late. The heat was so intense that rescuers could not reach parts of the factory until hours later, by which time the devastation was complete. By the end of the day, 58 people had lost their lives, and more than 150 others were injured, making it one of the deadliest industrial accidents in Massachusetts history. Entire families were shattered, as the victims were not just workers, but fathers, brothers, sisters, and sons, whose livelihoods had been tied to the Grover Shoe Factory. The city of Brockton was plunged into mourning, its tight-knit community shaken to its core. Churches held memorials, streets filled with grieving relatives, and the disaster became the defining tragedy of the town's history. Even those who had not lost loved ones could not escape the weight of sorrow, as the smoke rising from the destroyed building lingered as a haunting reminder of what had been lost. The disaster did not simply fade into memory. In the aftermath, investigators examined the wreckage and found clear evidence that the boiler had been poorly maintained and was no longer safe for operation. Public outrage grew, and the tragedy became a powerful call for reform. Massachusetts soon passed stricter regulations on boiler inspections, setting new standards that would eventually spread across the United States. The Grover Shoe Factory disaster became a grim reminder of the dangers of neglecting industrial safety, especially in an era when factories were rapidly expanding and workers often faced hazardous conditions. For the people of Brockton, it was more than just a news headline. It was a collective scar, a moment when progress had come at a terrible cost. Today, the disaster stands as both a cautionary tale and a turning point, reminding us that safety must never be taken for granted in the pursuit of industry. Jackson Pollock's death in 1956 wasn't just the tragic end of a famous painter. It was the kind of story that feels more like a scene from a cautionary movie than real life. By By then, Pollock was already a legend, known as the wild genius of abstract expressionism, splattering paint across canvases in ways that baffled some and mesmerized others. He was at once celebrated and criticized, a man whose talent seemed inseparable from his demons. Alcohol was his constant shadow, and it was not exactly a secret in the art world that his drinking was both fueling and destroying him. On the night of August 11th, 1956, those demons finally caught up. Driving his Oldsmobile convertible on the country roads of East Hampton, New York, Pollock was behind the wheel, drunk and reckless. With him were his mistress Ruth Kligman and her friend Edith Metzger. Less than a mile from his home, he lost control of the car, which skidded off the road, flipped, and slammed into a tree. The crash Pollock instantly and also claimed the life of Edith Metzger, while Ruth Kligman survived with serious injuries. It was a shocking, violent ending for an artist whose life had been one long collision between brilliance and self-destruction. The crash immediately took on a symbolic weight. Pollock had been struggling for years, his creativity had slowed, his drinking had worsened, and his marriage to fellow painter Lee Krasner was strained. He was just 44 years old. Still young enough that people expected more great work from him, but also old enough to have left a mark on art history. The manner of his death, reckless, dramatic, tragic, seemed to fit the myth of the tortured artist almost too perfectly. His wife Krasner, who was in Europe at the time, rushed back to New York when she heard the news. While grief-stricken, she took on the role of guardian of his legacy, ensuring that Pollock was remembered not just for the way he died, but for the art he left behind. She organized exhibitions, managed his estate, and effectively shaped how the world would come to view Jackson Pollock. In that sense, his death became the start of his immortality. What could have been just a tragic accident on a summer night instead turned into the cementing of a legend. Pollock the man was gone, but Pollock the icon, the revolutionary who changed modern art, was here to stay. Looking back, it is easy to see his fatal drive as the inevitable last act of someone who lived constantly on the edge. Pollock never did things halfway. His painting style was wild and physical, with him often dripping, flinging, and almost dancing with the canvas as if locked in combat. That same intensity carried over into his personal life, his drinking binges, his outbursts, his insecurities. The car crash was, in a way, an extension of that restless energy he could not control. Yet it would be unfair to reduce him only to that narrative of self-destruction. His art genuinely changed the way people thought about painting. He pushed boundaries, broke rules, and forced the world to see that beauty could come from chaos. The tragedy of his death is that it froze him forever at 44, leaving us to wonder what else he might have created had he lived longer. Had he found a way to escape the grip of alcohol? Had that car stayed on the road? But history rarely gives us what-ifs. Instead, it gives us stories like Jackson Pollock's, messy, dramatic, and unforgettable. His death may have been violent, but his influence remains unshaken, still splattered across the canvas of modern art history. It was April 6, 2018, on a quiet stretch of highway near Armley, Saskatchewan. A bus carried 28 souls, players, coaches, and staff from the Humboldt Broncos junior hockey team. They were headed north on Highway 35 toward Nipawin, chasing a playoff dream. For the town of Humboldt, a place of fewer than 6,000, the Broncos weren't just a hockey team. They were family. The boys lived with host families, went to local schools, and wore the green and gold with pride. That night, after a grueling triple overtime loss days before, they were determined to fight back in Game 5. The bus was driven by Glenn Dirksen, a seasoned, careful driver. Inside, the players were buzzing with energy, joking, listening to music, preparing themselves mentally for the game ahead. But around 5 p.m., just outside Tisdale, everything unraveled in an instant. At a place locals know as Armley Corner, the intersection of Highway 35 and Highway 335, the bus crossed paths with a transport truck. That truck was driven by 29-year-old Jaskirat Singh Sidhu, a new trucker hauling heavy bales of peat moss. He was supposed to stop at a flashing stop sign, but he didn't. Traveling nearly 100 kilometers per hour, Sidhu blew straight through it. And in that moment, the Broncos bus struck the side of the truck's lead trailer. The sound was deafening. The impact ripped the front of the bus apart, scattering metal, glass, and bodies into a nearby snowy field. The load of peat moss spilled everywhere. The chaos that followed was unbearable. Some players were thrown from the bus, their bodies lying in the snow. Others were trapped inside, screaming, crying, or silent. Defenseman Ryan Strashnitsky blacked out, only to wake moments later on the frozen ground. He couldn't move his legs. Around him lay teammates, bloodied and broken. Beside him, Nick Shumlansky moaned in pain. Not far away was defenseman Logan Boulet, who would not survive. 14 lives were lost right there at the scene. Emergency crews swarmed in, pulling survivors from the wreckage, rushing them to hospitals. 2 more would die in the days after. In total, 16 lives were taken. 10 players, ranging from just 16 to 21 years old, including Captain Logan Schatz and the youngest, Adam Harold, along with coaches, team staff, and driver Glenn Dirksen. The survivors were scarred forever, their lives divided into before and after. And then came the cruelest twist. In the aftermath, one of the defensemen, Xavier Labelle, was mistaken for teammate Parker Tobin. Both had dyed blonde hair, both had playoff beards. Label had no ID and was unconscious. His family was told he had died. Parker's family was told he had survived. It wasn't until days later, when Xavier opened his eyes and whispered his name, that the truth was revealed. 2 families had their worlds turned upside down twice. The crash shattered more than a team. It broke a nation's heart. Tributes poured in from across Canada and beyond. Wayne Gretzky wept in public. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau spoke in disbelief. Even Donald Trump sent condolences from the U.S. NHL players wore Broncos jerseys in honor. Investigators soon pieced together what had happened. Sidhu had missed more than just a stop sign. He had broken multiple safety rules in the days leading up to the crash, driving too long, failing to log his hours properly. He admitted he had been distracted by a flapping tarp on his trailer. He wasn't impaired, but he wasn't paying attention either. One small failure to stop cost 16 lives. In January 2019, Sidhu stood in court, his voice trembling as he pled guilty to 29 charges. He made no excuses. The judge sentenced him to 8 years in prison, but the story didn't end there. Sidhu was a permanent resident, not a Canadian citizen. After serving part of his sentence, he was granted parole, but deportation loomed. In May 2024, the order came. He was to be sent back to India. His lawyers appealed, pointing to his young son's serious health issues and the lack of adequate care in India. Families of the victims were split. Some believed deportation was justice. Others, like the father of Evan Thomas, said it wasn't necessary. Ryan Strashnitsky, now paralyzed from the chest down, chose compassion, saying he wished Sidhu peace, human to human. The story of the Monongah mining disaster of 1907 is like something out of a dark industrial-era nightmare, the kind of tragedy that makes you stop and wonder how people ever signed up for this job in the first place. Picture a small West Virginia town, cold December morning, and hundreds of miners, many of them immigrants from Italy, Hungary, Poland, and other parts of Europe, heading down into the Fairmont Coal Company's mines number 6 and No. 8. These guys were the backbone of the industrial boom, digging out coal to fuel America's rapid growth. But on December 6th, everything turned into chaos. At about 10:30 in the morning, a massive explosion ripped through the underground tunnels, sending shockwaves that shook the ground above like an earthquake. Houses rattled, windows shattered, and people in the town rushed out thinking the world itself might be splitting in two. The blast was caused by a lethal mix of coal dust and methane gas, which in a poorly ventilated mine is basically like stacking dynamite and waiting for someone to strike a match. The explosion ripped through the mine shafts, collapsing tunnels, blowing machinery apart, and releasing a wave of deadly carbon monoxide that suffocated nearly everyone inside. Official reports put the death toll at 362, but locals whispered it was way higher, maybe closer to 500 or more, since many unregistered immigrant workers and even teenage boys were inside that day. The sheer scale of loss was staggering. Entire families were torn apart because fathers, sons, and brothers often worked side by side underground. And when disaster struck, it wiped out multiple generations in one horrific instant. Rescue attempts were brave but grim. Teams went down into the choking blackness, hoping to pull survivors out, but most of what they found were lifeless bodies. The gas was so thick and poisonous that even the rescuers themselves sometimes collapsed before making it back out. Above ground, the town of Monongah turned into a scene of heartbreak, with wives, mothers, and children crowding around the mine entrances waiting for news that never came. Church bells rang. Funeral processions stretched on, and cemeteries filled faster than anyone could have imagined. Some widows were left with 6 or 7 children to raise on their own, and immigrant families who had already sacrificed everything to come to America now found themselves broken and destitute. There were stories of women fainting when they saw the wagons carrying out bodies, of children crying at the mine gates, and of local officials struggling to even count the dead properly because so many workers had never been formally registered. The whole town was drenched in grief, and yet the mine owners at the time offered little more than token compensation, a few dollars to families, hardly enough to buy food for a week, let alone rebuild a shattered life. The scale of indifference was almost as shocking as the explosion itself, a cruel reminder of how little power laborers had in that era. But the Monongah disaster was not just another tragic entry in the long list of industrial accidents. It became a turning point that forced America to take a harder look at mine safety. Public outrage eventually led to the creation of the United States Bureau of Mines in 1910, which was tasked with investigating explosions, improving ventilation, and making sure safety measures were enforced. Of course, change was slow and mining remained dangerous for decades, but Monongah stood as a grim symbol of what happens when profit is placed above human lives. Today, the disaster is remembered with memorials in both West Virginia and in Italy, since so many of the victims were Italian immigrants whose names and stories live on through descendants. Walking through Monongah today, you will not hear the roar of the mines, but you will see monuments that quietly tell of the day the town lost nearly everything in a single blast. It is a story of loss, resilience, and the harsh price paid in the pursuit of coal, but it also serves as a reminder of how human suffering can sometimes push the world toward change. The Monongah mining disaster might be more than a century old, yet its echoes still rumble in history, reminding us that behind every lump of coal once stood a man who risked his life to dig it from the earth. Roland Ratzenberger's story is one of both inspiration and tragedy, the kind that reminds us of the razor-thin line between ambition and danger in Formula One. In the spring of 1994, Ratzenberger was living his lifelong dream, competing at the highest level of motorsport. Born in Austria, he had worked his way up through the ranks, a journeyman racer who was more grit than glamour, finally landing a seat with the small but determined Simtek team. For him, even a modest F1 drive meant he had reached the pinnacle. That weekend at Imola, however, fate would write his name into history under the darkest of circumstances. During qualifying for the San Marino Grand Prix, Ratzenberger's front wing sustained damage on an earlier lap after running wide. Instead of returning to the pits, he pushed on for another flying lap after all. This was only his second race weekend in Formula One, and he was desperate to prove himself. As he hurtled down toward the Villeneuve corner at more than 300 kilometers per hour, the weakened wing gave way completely. In an instant, his Simtek lost downforce and control, sending the car straight on into a concrete wall at terrifying speed. The impact was catastrophic, leaving him with a fatal skull fracture. Rescue crews arrived quickly, but there was nothing that could be done. Roland Ratzenberger was just 33 years old. The shock of Ratzenberger's death rippled through the paddock. It had been 12 years since Formula One had lost a driver during a Grand Prix weekend, and the sport had lulled itself into a fragile sense of safety. Ratzenberger's accident was a brutal reminder that the risks were never truly gone. Yet, in the cruelest twist of fate, his death was almost immediately overshadowed by what happened the very next day, when Ayrton Senna, one of the greatest drivers the sport has ever known, was killed during the race. In the collective memory of fans and the media, Senna's passing became the defining tragedy of Imola '94, often leaving Ratzenberger remembered as the other driver who died that weekend. But for those who knew him, friends, family, fellow racers, Roland's loss was no less profound. He had fought hard to get to Formula One, and his story was one of perseverance, passion, and the determination to chase a dream even when the odds seemed stacked against him. In the aftermath, though, Ratzenberger's death was far from forgotten by the governing body. Along with Senna's, his accident became the catalyst for sweeping changes in safety standards across Formula One. Track layouts were altered to include more runoff areas and fewer concrete walls close to the racing line. Car designs were re-evaluated to better withstand high-speed impacts. The FIA pushed forward with reforms that led to the introduction of the Hans device to prevent fatal head injuries, safer cockpit structures, and stricter crash tests for teams. It is a legacy written in both loss and progress. Drivers today benefit from protections that emerged out of that dark weekend at Imola. Roland Ratzenberger may not be the first name that comes to mind when people recall Formula One's history, but his sacrifice helped shape the safer sport we see today. His story is a poignant reminder that behind every helmet is a human being, carrying dreams, risks, and vulnerabilities, and that even in tragedy, change and awareness can emerge. Ratzenberger's career may have been brief, but his impact on the sport continues to resonate decades later. It was May 4th, 2013, on Interstate 20 in Georgia. The Karth family was on a long drive from North Carolina to Texas, headed to a wedding. Behind the wheel was Mary Ann Karth, a devoted mother of 9. That day, 3 of her children were with her, Caleb in the front seat, and Analia and Mary in the back. 17-year-old Analia was the quiet one, thoughtful, creative, always writing. Her 18th birthday was just around the corner. Beside her sat 13-year-old Mary, the life of the family, with her 2 braids bouncing on her shoulders, always ready to make everyone laugh. Caleb, calm and steady, watched the road ahead. He would be the only one of the 3 to walk away from what was about to happen. Around noon, traffic slowed. Mary Ann tapped the brakes, careful, leaving space between her car and the one in front. But behind them, disaster was already racing forward. A truck hauling cars thundered closer, and the driver never hit the brakes. In an instant, the truck slammed into the back of the Karth's Ford Crown Victoria with devastating force, shoving the car sideways into oncoming traffic. Another vehicle struck them, crushing them further, before their car was pushed under the trailer ahead. That trailer had an underride guard, a steel bar meant to stop smaller vehicles from sliding underneath. But in that moment, when it mattered most, it snapped apart like a twig. The Karth's car was swallowed beneath the truck. The rear end of the car, where Analia and Mary were sitting, was destroyed in an instant. Analia never had a chance. She died immediately. Mary was still alive, but her body was crushed, her injuries catastrophic. Emergency workers fought to save her. They had to cut her braids, her signature look, the hair she had never once cut in her life, just to reach her injuries. 4 days later, on May 8th, Mary died in the hospital. Mary Ann survived with painful injuries, Caleb with a concussion. The truck driver was found unconscious after the crash. Investigators said he had drifted, lost control. He later pled guilty to charges connected to the wreck. His commercial license was suspended for 2 years. But Mary Ann and her husband Jerry couldn't just bury their daughters and move on. They wanted answers. Why had the underride guard failed so catastrophically? It had met federal safety standards, but those standards were from 1998, and those rules never required testing for real-world strength. On paper, it was safe. In reality, it was deadly. Mary Ann began speaking out, carrying her daughter's story everywhere she went. She carried Mary's cut braids with her to events, holding them up as a heartbreaking symbol of what had been lost. Her voice, joined by others, made waves. Some trailer manufacturers listened. In 2015, companies like Stoughton and Vanguard began building stronger guards. J.B. Hunt even ordered trailers with improved safety features. Not because the government forced them to, because grieving families demanded it. But change at the federal level was painfully slow. Proposals dragged on for years. It wasn't until 2022, nearly a decade after the crash, that stronger underride rules were finally enacted. And even then, side guards, which could save countless lives, were left out. Today, most trucks on American highways still don't have them. For Mary Ann, this fight became her life's work. She partnered with another mother, Lois Durso, who also lost a daughter in an underride crash. Together, they lobbied, met lawmakers, filed petitions, and pushed relentlessly. Parts of their proposal were included in the 2021 bipartisan infrastructure bill, but still, many gaps remain.